Welcome to the Rig Doctor podcast, where I'm giving out remedies to soothe your ailing tone and fix your sick pedalboards. I'm your host, Mason Marangella, aka the Rig Doctor. I've been building rigs for over a decade for many of the industry's top pros, and now I'm giving away all my secrets to DIYers just like you. I'm giving away all of my tips, tricks, resources, and easy hacks that I've learned over the years so you can build a pedal board just like a pro. If you want to support this podcast, you can do it in a bunch of different ways. Easiest way is to write us a review on iTunes, or you could follow us on social media, places like Instagram, Facebook, or YouTube. You can also support us financially by purchasing one of my products, Vertex Effects, from any of our authorized dealers all around the world. Or you could become a member of our Patreon. We have several Patreon memberships as low as $4.99 a month that give you exclusive access to private live streams, Q&As, exclusive deals and discounts on Vertex products, as well as early access to new product releases. Also, you can get personalized one-on-one phone and email conversations with me, the Rig Doctor, to coach you through your next rig build. This could be as in-depth as troubleshooting a problem on your pedal board in real time with me, or some emails advising you on next steps, on certain pieces of gear to buy, and good stuff just like that. I don't want money, though, to be the reason that you can't engage with the Patreon side. So if you don't have the means to do it at this particular time, that's no problem. We actually offer a free version of our standard account at no charge if means are an issue. That means if you just send us an email requesting a free account, we grant 100% of those accounts, no charge whatsoever. We just trust that once things have changed for you and you can afford the $4.99 a month, you let us know. But until then, your account remains free. I also want to give a big shout out to our sponsor, Blue Microphones. Kevin Walt at Blue Mics is just the man. He gave us everything. We have Yeti mics, we have boom arms, we have pop filters, we have everything that a podcaster would need, and we supremely appreciate that. Thank you to Blue Microphones. In this episode, I'm speaking with Paul Rivera of Rivera Amplification. If you don't know it, before Paul was even the amplifier guru that he is now, he actually got his sea legs in the industry from doing repairs and mods, but also doing pedal boards. And I really credit him with being the first guy that was really doing any sort of professional grade pedal boards in the country, if not the world. He's right there with Pete Cornish and other guys like that, although I'm not sure that they were aware of each other existing on two different continents before the age of the internet. Paul kind of walks us through his early career, coming to LA, working in Valley Arts, which is a famous guitar manufacturing company that made kind of all the super strats that we know today were all sort of embedded in the actual Valley Arts instruments that had Floyd Roses and active electronics and things like that. They kind of started that whole fad that kind of spun off Tyler Guitars and Charvel and Schecter and all that stuff. And he talks about how he was operating into there and was really getting into contact with all the session musicians and doing custom modifications for them to their amplifiers and also building them custom rigs. So it was really interesting to hear his perspective on how things have morphed and how things have stayed the same, and also his arc in developing Rivera Amplification, having come from Fender as one of their head designers. They kind of has a whole generation of Fender amplifiers to his credit. So without further delay, I bring you Paul Rivera. Paul, I really appreciate you making the time to speak with me, and I had so much fun talking with you last time, and there was a lot more I wanted to talk to you about, and I wanted to talk about your amps and not just the pedalboard thing, although there'll be probably some crossover on this, but there's it's sort of a different audience. I'd say this audience for the podcast thing is a little more technical, and so you can get into some of this stuff, and it's not just gonna go over everybody's heads. So
Cool.
So to the degree to which you're willing and comfortable doing that, I'd love to talk to you about that stuff. And just so I kind of know your for timekeeping purposes, what do you have available, and I'll make sure that I kind of structure the questions so that.
I think we have a good hour.
Okay, that's what I planned for. So great. Well, let's just get right into it. I'm just going to kind of talk to you first about the beginnings, kind of how things got started. And you talked to me about this before, but I just want to pretend as though you never told me anything before, because most of the people listening to this may not realize how influential you were, not only in the pedalboard scene, but in the amplifier scene. And really, in my mind, you were one of the original guys that kind of started this whole boutique craze by the mods that you were doing. So can you tell me about that? I'm going to mute my microphone while you're talking, just so there's not any interference.
Well, how far back do you want to go?
I mean, I think let's start with Paul Rivera is I don't know. I presume you started taking up electronics as a teenager or something like that. So let's start earlier this time. I think last time when we talked, we started at Valley Arts.
Right.
And so maybe take us back further than that, and then kind of through.
Well, God, it's I got into electronics because my two elder brothers, were ham radio dudes. And so when I was a little kid, I would go into the ham shack, and they were all, tube gear, and they'd be pounding Morse code and, get away from me, kid, but, I would persist, and then they would tell me that they're, communicating with somebody on the other side of the planet. I mean, I kind of knew even at early age, there was this country named Russia, and they were communicating with Russia. That knocked my socks off. So the fact that my brothers actually built their own ham gear, a lot of it was, I can't even tell you, my brothers were like God, oh my God, you built that stuff. So I think they were really the ones. And that was kind of between ages of, say, 6 and 9, where I got really serious into it. And then when I moved to New York City, when I was 11, I had a buddy in junior high school in New York City that was into electronics, and he and I both got into ham radio and so on, kind of serious. And simultaneous to that, I had been raised with music. My mother was my piano teacher, and she had her master's in music. And so when I was raised with keyboards, I started playing keyboards probably as soon as I could sit on the piano bench and reach the keys. But when the Beatles came to America, I basically thought to myself, screw keyboards, I want to play guitar. And so that was where the marriage of guitar and amp, I begged my parents to buy me an amplifier, and I finally wound up with a Vibrachamp from Jimmy's Music on 48th Street. But in the meantime, the reason that they really bought me that amp is because I had destroyed their clock radio trying to inject a guitar into it. I ruined my neighbor's Grundig radio that had that PU input on the back. Man, I tell you, the distortion out of that Grundig, though, was awesome. And let's see, I even tried to add an audio input to our television set. I was so desperate. My guitar was one of those cigarette brand guitars. I can't remember, it was a Winston or a Salem. And it had a neck that could have been a Louisville Slugger, and had no intonation on the bridge. It was one of those bridges that just had a straight line across, so you could never, get it in tune. But it was my guitar, and you could talk into the pickups. It had crystal pickups. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to, what a piece of shit. And sorry for the swearing. But anyway, so, I think my parents figured out that it was cheaper for me to get an amp than it was to blow up everything in the house. So that said, my friends in junior high school had a band, and they all had reverb, and my Vibrachamp didn't. So I went crazy trying to add reverb to my Vibrachamp, and I wound up smoking the output transformer of the Vibrachamp. Just as my father came home, there's flames coming out of my bedroom as the output transformer is on fire. It was a little difficult to explain, but anyway, that's kind of what got it all started. And then, fortunately, we had 48th Street, and so my buddies and I used to take the subway down to 48th Street and hang out. And basically, the amount of saliva that came out of our mouths drooling in the window, looking at the window of Manny's music. Oh my God, a tremolox. Oh my God. Whatever it was in the window, they would always change what was in the window. And so the thing is that I knew a lot more about electronics than any of my friends. And so they would come to me and ask me to fix their amps and that sort of thing. That's really how it kind of started. And then, I guess I was 13 or 14 years old and super hungry for electronic knowledge. During the summer of '67, I worked at a company down in Manhattan called Continental Telephone that made micro miniature spy equipment for the CIA, FBI, and lettered agencies that nobody ever heard of and were classified to even speak the letters. But it taught me a lot. I learned a lot about soldering and, all that, because you had to be super careful with such miniature stuff. So anyway, friends would come to me, say with their deluxe reverbs or whatever the amps were, and ask me not only to repair them, can you make it louder? Can you make more power? So you kind of get started on that learning path. And fortunately, I was blessed with a photographic memory. So I used to collect schematics and then just study schematics and take mental snapshots. And that's part of the learning process too, to see whether it's a vintage Vox amp or a Magnatone or whatever the amps were, just to see what the circuits were. Now, why does this thing have a cathode resistor on the output tubes? Why does this? Why does that? So you start building a lookup table, especially when you get to repair them, because then you get to hear them. And then you also get to see all the failure modes, which is really, I think any engineer should be a repairman for a couple of years, because the practicality of seeing what fails is so huge. And most engineers are isolated from that. I could go on for hours about that. So let's see. So my first amp shop was out of Eddie Bell Guitars, 201 West 49th Street between 7th and Broadway on the second floor. And the guys at Eddie Bell were kind enough to give me a space, and I set up a workbench and test equipment in the back. And then there were so many interesting pros in Manhattan that went through that shop, and I got a chance to not only fix and destroy their equipment, but I had an opportunity. They would come to me and ask me about things. And you know what it is that I think we talked about this before. Never take a musician literally on what he's asking for, because he may not know the terms to use. If a musician says, yeah, man, I want more power, what he really meant was he wanted more gain, but he didn't know to ask that. So you have to figure that out through trial and error. Oh, that's what he really meant. And, it just goes on and on and on. So I developed a lookup table of, oh, this equals this, or that what he really meant was that. And that was my first real time to do that, was in the summer of '68 in New York City at Eddie Bell Guitars. So I got into the first requests, and serious requests were from Marshall 100-watt top owners. Could you please figure out a way to keep this amp from blowing up? And very early Marshalls were really the high voltage on those plates. Those poor EL34s were screaming for bloody mercy because they had such high voltages. On the other hand, they sounded like God. So it was very interesting. So fortunately, am I talking too much? Okay. Fortunately, the guys at Unicord or whoever, can't remember, it was Merson or Unicord, which eventually became Korg, were the importers of Marshalls. And they had an Eastern European guy who was an engineer. And he was so patient with me. I would call him up on the phone. Why did this output transformer smoke? And then he would start to tell me all the different reasons why this would happen, that happened, and so on. And so, imagine you get a Marshall Major in, And Marshall Majors were notorious because they had such high plate voltage for smoke in the output tubes. And so anyway, there was that. And then guys would come in with Fenders. At the time, let's say 1967, 68, 69, there was such an explosion in music. And you had so many British invasion bands with just really unique sounds. And I think a lot of guys were very curious, how do I get those sounds? So it was a learning process for me as well as them to figure that out. So I wound up, actually in 68, I wound up modifying Fender Twins and amps like that to have higher gain and more sensitivity and so on, because they were so darn clean, especially with a pair of JBL D120s. Good Lord. Country music, amen, brother. But rock and roll was another story. So, that was really the beginnings. And then in 69, I went up to upstate New York, summer of 69, a little bit of the spring, and built a recording studio up in upstate New York in Ulster County in a little town called Crumville. It was actually off Route 28 near Olive Bridge and near the Shokan Reservoir. And I had a lot of musicians come through that studio. I mean, Van Morrison and, just the Children of God and the Fugs. And and it was really fascinating. So I got a chance to repair their gear as well as try out mods on their gear. And again, it's all a learning process. What equals what and what sounds better and so on, because it's really kind of a blank slate that you're starting from in terms of a knowledge base. Nobody is writing this out for you to learn from. So anyway, that's 69. And then the summer of 70, I moved back out to California, and I worked in the summertime over at Quilter Sound, which was Pat Quilter was building these really lovely solid state amps down in Orange County. This is 1970 summer. And I didn't get really a chance to do much, but I had a lot of musicians in the area where I would repair the amps and modify them at home and so on. Again, part of the learning process and so on. And then in 71, I moved back to New York, set up a shop out of my apartment in Yonkers, modifying amps. And then I got tired of New York and said, West, young man, West. And so I moved out to San Diego, which I really love San Diego. And I opened a shop called Libretronics on University and 37th. And started, building up a reputation within the musician community down in San Diego. And guys would bring me all kinds of amplifiers, and whether it was putting in extra gain stages or master volumes or, and then the first effects loop I think I did was like 73, something like that. Some guy wanted to interface his pedal board into his amplifier, and that's something around that time. One of my favorite mods for Marshalls was actually replacing the output transformers with Dynaco output transformers. And the reason I used Dynaco output transformers is they sounded so damn good. And they were far more forgiving for transient peaks than the Dagnalls that were in the 100-watt tops. And again, doing gain mods and so on. And the same thing with Fenders. I had a lot of guys that wanted to play rock and roll, and they needed more gain and more distortion out of their Fenders and so on. So between Fenders and Marshalls, I developed quite a bag of mods. And then, the problem with the music scene down in San Diego was, there wasn't enough gigs unless you wanted to play at Camp Pendleton. And there was just not enough professional musicians that are willing to pay or have custom equipment constructed or whatever the case may be. So then I met Red Rhodes, and Red had a repair shop up in Hollywood called Royal Amp Service. And I really loved the pickups he used to rewind. I used to drive up to Los Angeles. He'd rewind pickups for me. I'd bring him down to San Diego. And, install them guys' guitars. And so I developed a good relationship with Red, and he was a jovial guy. Red's thing was making amps more powerful. He really enjoyed taking a Fender Princeton, putting twin reverb power transformers in it in 6550s, and listen how loud that is. But he was also a steel guitar player, so he kind of came from a different angle. And so that's how I got my start in Hollywood. Is I moved up to Los Angeles and opened up and worked in Red's shop from, I want to say, like the middle of 75 to early 76. And at the time, that's when I met the studio cats like Jay Graydon and Dean Parks and so on, because they heard about me through Jay and Dean and started bringing me gear, and I started modifying their Princetons and deluxe reverbs and Larry Carl. And as I've told you this before, that's kind of how it started with all the studio cats. So then Mike and Al at Valley Arts, two of my favorite people in the universe, had heard about me and told Jay to get in contact with me. And that's when they invited me to come over to Valley Arts and open up the shop. And, Red was a super guy, but, he had his own issues and things that were going on and so on. So, anyway, the Mike and Al were great guys. And so I decided to open up at Valley Arts. And that was really an interesting time because it was like an explosion in the studio scene. And Valley Arts was really in the epicenter. All the studio cats. And, they were repairing guitars. One of the guys I met when I was at Royal was a guy named, give me a second. Oh, let me keep talking and his name will pop into my head. Anyway, he was from Paracho, Michoacan, and he was a guitar luthier. And I don't know if you know anything about Paracho, Michoacan, but basically the entire town and the surrounding Indian villages are built on making guitars. And they make about 1 million guitars a year out of this little tiny town. Manuel Rios was his name. Shame on me. I should always remember that. Such a sweet cat. So I brought Manuel over to Valley Arts. And so Manuel was with Mike and Al on one side of the shop. I was on the other side, working on amplifiers and modifying and building the pedal boards and so on. So that kind of takes us up to the Valley Arts era. There you go.
Well, that's great. And, I really, the thing that I find, most interesting about your kind of history and trajectory, and I've mentioned this to you before, is that most people are completely unaware of that whole pedalboard thing. They know about your amps, and there's a legacy of those. And after our last conversation, and I think I told you I bought one of your concerts, Fender concert heads. I still need to figure out, I still want to find one of the modded deluxe reverbs, but they're untouchable. I think you can't find them anymore. Everybody who has them keeps them.
Well, that's a good sign, I guess.
yeah, it is. But I wanted to know, like, in terms of like when you got into the Valley Arts thing, would you say that guys like Dean Parks and Jay Graydon were the guys that really sort of catapulted the Rivera name as far as its reputation and notoriety as a brand? Or what was like the turning point, would you say, of when all of a sudden it was like the phone wouldn't stop ringing, you had this crazy backlog of work? Like, what was that turning point?
I don't think I can figure out point my finger at it, because it was really a groundswell. And when Jay would turn up at sessions, and Dean Parks as well, one of my modified amps, of course, the other guys had to have it too. And so the other session cats, Mitch Holder was there from the very early days and asked me to build him a pedal board, which he nicknamed R2D2 Super. God, that must have been 76. So, Lee Rittenauer, those guys are they were the upper echelon of cats. And, Tommy Tedesco wrote up about my amp several times in Guitar Player magazine in his session log column that he used to do. And that really helped a lot. And when I got a call from Chet Atkins and Paul Yandell out of Nashville, that was a big turning point because they had heard about my gear, and Jerry Reed and a bunch of other cats from Nashville. Hey, Paul. So they would send me their amps and I'd modify them and they would go back to Nashville. And that really made a big difference too, because now you got country cats that are recording it, not only the heavyweights out of Hollywood, but certainly Jay Graydon and Dean Parks and, Mitch and those guys were a big part of it. I don't know if there was any one point, but I can tell you this, Valley Arts sold a lot of deluxe reverbs that were modified, that became modified amps. So probably Al Carness knows the numbers of what they sell, but conservatively, I would say it was a couple hundred that went through there. One of the funny things about those deluxe reverbs, and Jay, who has a golden ear, they would get in about 20 deluxe reverbs and Jay would have them lined up. And I really could not believe the difference in sound between those 20. Probably out of 20, there might have been 3 or 4 that sounded decent. And there were some dogs. Woof! How did they let that out of the factory? And a lot of it was tolerance stacking because 20% here, 20% there. But, because they were hand-wired chassis, the wire dress was critical for the sound. And I don't think anybody in the Fender assembly line had a clue that if you took this wire and moved it over there, all of a sudden the amp changed character. Certainly when I was at Fender, nobody ever talked about lead dress, on the chassis, except the people in R&D, and they go batty trying to teach the assembly people, no, don't put that wire over there, so high impedance tube circuits. Gee, who would have thought lead dress could make a difference? So, anyway, those guys had golden ears and they were all super helpful and, so on. So, it was really because of that groundswell that Yamaha asked me to help them on their amp project, and then Music Man and Pig Nose and, on and on.
Yeah. And at this time too, you're doing the amps, and were you doing the pedal boards concurrently with that, or was that like a service that became offered later on?
No, it was important. It was concurrent with that because these guys would have echoplexes that were too noisy. They would have Boss chorus pedals that sucked. They would have, it just went on and on. As we talked about, all the different issues with the different effects. When Lexicon came out with a brand new rack unit, or, Eventide would come out with a new rack unit, gee, how do I interface this with my, other pedals and so on? So it was all simultaneous because, they're not isolated. You're solving the issues with the amps. You need to solve the issues with the pedal boards as well.
Yeah, and so you were. This was even before MIDI, I presume. If this is then this.
Oh yeah.
So how are you adapting this rack gear? Because presumably all that stuff was designed for a mix bus, so it was all 100% wet. How are you dealing with that?
Well, like we talked about, it made me create a lot of bud box electronics to be able to interface, especially, good Lord, you get a rack unit capable of a +10, +6, whatever, and you've got a -20 or a minus whatever, even a -10 on the pedal board. So you need amplifiers to go in. You may need to push it, balanced. In that case, I was using Jensen transformers at the time. Tommy Reichenbach Reichenbach Engineering was building them for Dean Jensen, and so I would use a lot of their transformers. This is, of course, long before Cinemag existed. So that's how I kind of did it, where you needed to drive it balanced, or you needed to drive it a line level input, and then you needed to attenuate coming out of it because you're pushing it so hard. So whatever it took, but it was really up to the guitar players to say, these are the effects that I want to use. This is kind of what I got in mind. Make it work. They didn't really give a shit. How? Can I plug my guitar in and it sounds good? Okay, cool.
And
okay.
Was this the point with which you came up with your Rivera buffers, or was that something that you were like building custom for a long time and then it became its own product, or how did that work?
Yeah, that's exactly correct. It's necessity, mother of invention kind of idea. So let's see, the first buffers were in black bud boxes. I mean, it might even have one or two that I had anodized and then screened. And then two guys, there was a guy who had put out a record of Ted Green. You know who Ted Green was, right?
Of course, yeah.
God rest his soul. Anyway, he had put out a record, and he created a small little company called Professional Music Products, and they approached me about doing the buffers for them. Of course, the biggest problem with the buffers is because you don't really hear, like a fuzz box, that it's doing something. It takes a lot of explaining to let them know, oh yeah, you ought to use one of these. It's going to make it sound better. So that was 78, I think, was the first year that I released the boxes with a die-cast bud boxes drilled out with circuit boards in it. And then it was Leon White was the gentleman behind Professional Music Products. So then, that's when we started building the buffers, and we built them actually in my garage up in Tahunga. They paid for the tooling for that wedge-shaped pedal, which in $1978, the tooling was $10,000. God forbid what it is today. That was a lot of money, 10 grand. Right. So anyway, they paid for it. It was done by a company out in Sun Valley by the name of Art Mold over on Sheldon, I think, in Sun Valley. And so we had a couple of people up in my garage in Tahunga actually assembling them. And so we built, 10,000 of them or something. It was a lot of buffers. And Leon's company would sell them to the music stores, and I got a royalty out of it. So it was cool. And then, I'm sorry, go on.
I was going to ask if they were only input buffers or output buffers, or they were both. I don't remember I know I've only seen a certain variety of it. I know that you made some that were had A/B switches at the end, but was the intent that people would only use them up front, or was there output buffers as well for the end of the chain?
No, it was just a single buffer. It was just a way to drive your effects pedals, keep it simple, stupid, and then it wasn't really very complicated. I think had I not, spent time, designing Pick Nose amps or doing the Yamaha thing, or eventually going on to Fender in 81, we probably could have expanded the product line to do all kinds of stuff. But Professional Music Products was not strong enough financially. And so it kind of limited, and certainly, the marketing or something, it wasn't something that I really wanted to take on at the time.
Yeah.
So,
I hear you.
yeah. Oh, and then, Fender, when I was a little kid, you could probably ask my friends who are professional musicians they grew up to be when we were in high school. My dream at the time when I was, junior high school, was to someday work for Fender. So when I got an opportunity to create Fender amplifiers, I wasn't going to turn it down. That was like a gig out of my 12-year-old dreams, Your mic's muted.
There we go. Yeah, sorry. So you went from doing your own thing through the Valley Art shop. You had some products that were made by another company that you were designing and would get a royalty from, and then you went to work for Fender following that.
Yes.
Yeah, and you talked to me last time we spoke a little bit about kind of what it looked like working for Fender, and eventually, ultimately what kind of changes that were made there allowed you to then spin off and do your own thing and make your own amplifiers. Can you tell me like a little bit about what's that?
Silly me.
Yeah. So can you tell me maybe just a little bit about like how it went, how Fender got in touch with you and how you kind of went to work for them, and then how that spun off into actually became Rivera Amplification?
So Roger Balmer, who was the product manager at Yamaha, John McLaren, who was, I think he was president of Yamaha America, and Bill Schultz was actually he had come from a band instrument repair background and then got into sales at Yamaha. So I knew them pretty well from my work at Yamaha. So when they were hired by CBS to take over the management of Fender, and Roger looked at what was happening with the amplifier sales, and the amplifier sales were in the frickin' toilet. So they basically made a decision, okay, let's get some guys from Yamaha, Dan Smith on guitars, who was product manager for guitars. Let's get Paul Rivera to do amplifiers. And Roger also had dreams, Roger Balmer, coming from Yamaha. He was involved in the DX7 project, along with the engineering team. Now, I had worked closely with the engineering team. Harry Suzuki, who was in charge of the team at Yamaha, Mike Kachihata was the chief engineer on their guitar amps in Japan. I enjoyed working with those gentlemen so much in developing the Yamaha, Mark II series. So anyway, Roger called me up one day. I knew that he had gone from Music Man. He left Yamaha, went to Music Man, worked with Tommy Walker for a while, and then he went on to Fender. While he was at Music Man, he asked me to assist in consulting at Music Man. And so this is before they hired Mark Wentling to do some of the engineering work. So Tommy Walker needed help because his amplifiers sounded, I'm going backwards, but I'll go forwards here in a minute. Tommy Walker was such a sweetheart. What a gentleman. And his amplifiers, I got to tell you, for a hybrid amp, certainly sounded good. Those early Music Mans with the tube phase inverter output stage, even though they had LM307s in the preamp, they still sounded darn good. But they were not a rock and roll amplifier. They were a clean amp. So anyway, I helped a little bit of consulting at Music Man with Roger Balmer. So Roger Balmer goes on to Fender and asked me to join Fender to redo the amplifier line. Now, that was January of 1981. I had just finished, the Pignose 150 Cross Mix, which I designed, had been in production for about a year and a half. It had some teething issues, but eventually we were able to solve that. And so he asked me, we have meetings, I agreed to come on board, but Roger wanted me to develop a 5-year plan. How do we get Fender back in the amp business, and how do we get our sales up? So I actually created a 5-year plan, which is so Japanese. I mean, he used to do that at Yamaha. We need a 5-year plan. So, and because of the Japanese corporate structure, they like that. Okay, we can do this step, then we go this step, then we go this step, that sort of thing. And so that's fine with me. And so I sketched out virtually the first 3 years of amplifiers, but it was all done. The Japanese word for it is himitsu, which is basically secret. And the reason is the politics inside Fender were kind of steep. And the politics between the R&D team, which was led by a wonderful guy, and Bob Hagler was in charge of the R&D team. So, I worked, I would say probably 3 months on this 5-year plan with features, functions, names, schematics of solid state as well as tube amplifiers, because the thing about the solid state is it's pretty hard to get an aggressive price point with a tube amplifier, because as you well know, they're expensive to build. And Fender had a train wreck history of solid state amps. I mean, I have a saying, yesterday's dogs will become tomorrow's classics. And I can't believe how some of those old Fender solid-state amps, first of all, that they still work. And second of all, somebody would actually want to buy them. I thought they were just dreadful. So from a quality standpoint, as well as a tonality standpoint. So anyway, the thing is, we needed solid-state amplifiers. So I developed a line, and then I came on board publicly. I'd have to say it was probably April or May of '81, and then made the presentation to the R&D team a couple of months later. We had an industrial design house in this is before CAD, right? So we really didn't have a way, you either hand drew it or whatever. But in Hollywood, there was a really cool industrial design firm that had designed the original Airstream trailer. Anyway, they took my hand drawings of features and functions and actually created blueprints out of them. And that's what we presented in a 5-year plan in a big, bound notebook of price points, features, functions. And then eventually, after we presented it to R&D, to the Fender R&D, let's see, about that time, Fender also hired Roger Cox, who had come out of originally Ampeg, and then he was with Norlin doing Gibson amplifiers. And then a little later on, we hired Bill Hughes, who was a friend of Roger Cox, who had been at Ampeg and was responsible for a lot of the Ampeg solid-state stuff. Plus, as a very young man, he was also in on the original SVT amplifier. So anyway, Bill Hughes came on board. Roger Cox came on board. Roger was in charge of R&D for guitars, the whole shooting match. I think that's kind of how it went, if my memory serves me well. And so the engineering team, there was 2 teams, really. There was the tube team at R&D, which was basically Ed Johns. And Ed, what a history. Every time I talked with Ed, my respect got greater. I mean, imagine having a history of working with Major Armstrong on the development of the FM radio. Damn. Yeah, I'm going to teach him something? I don't think so. And the problem for Ed was he didn't understand a lot of musical stuff. For example, I came to him and said, hey, Ed, you ought to listen to these Chinese 12AX7s. They sound totally different than those General Electrics. How can that be? That's not true. Let me measure them. So he'd measure them and go, they can't sound different. They have the same mu, and they have the same this, and they have the same that, blah, blah, blah. No. Really, Ed, you got to listen. So there was a lot of difficulty in trying to convince Ed about tone. So I'll give you a case in point. One of the amplifiers I canceled as soon as I got into Fender was the Fender 75. The Fender 75 was a really poor attempt at ripping off a Mark II Boogie. In fact, I think I told you this. Randy Smith called me on the phone and asked me if he should sue Fender. Randy, there are huge floors full of lawyers inside of CBS Tower that will rip you to shreds. You don't want to do that. I'm canceling the amp. Don't worry about it. It'll be history. Okay, so the Fender 75 had screen taps on the output tube. So for Ed Johns, having screen taps, did that thing just block your vision? No, you're fine. I'm fine, right? Okay. So anyway, the screen taps introduced ripple onto the screens. And he couldn't hear that. For him, it was awesome because it got an extra 10 or 15 watts out of it. And, oh my God, these amps are blazing. Because the marketing department under Denny Handa or whoever the predecessor was, we need more power, Ed. We need more power. Nobody was talking about the darn tone. So, one of my favorite mods to Fender 75s was completely rewiring the output stage and the power supply and eliminating that ripple intermodulation on the note. In fact, I recall that Roger Cox had asked me to demonstrate it to Ed Johns. So took a Fender 75. I wired it with a switch that had, fixed power supply to the screens through a filter choke or signal through the screens. And the difference was night and day, because you could hear all those sideband products because the ripple was on the screens. And when you didn't have signal on the screens and you just had a clean power supply, none of that was there. And they had never heard it, and nobody had ever told them about it. So that was a very, very interesting time. I got some flack because we had a shitload of chassis in the warehouse that we couldn't use. The other one, which was a woof, was the Fender 140, which is basically a 4-tube version of the Fender 75. I was so happy to get rid of that pig. I mean, and God bless Ed Johns. He was just not a music guy, you know. So where does that leave us? The Fender concert, I think, was 1982, NAMM 82. And we showed at NAMM 82 a whole new line, including the Super Champ, Deluxe Reverb 2, Twin 2, et cetera, et cetera. And I remember Leo coming by with George Fullerton to the stand. And, you know, Leo looked up with those big glasses that he had, and looked up at me. I said, Leo, the proudest moment of my life is for me to show you what I did with the Fender brand name. Oh, that looks very nice. That's what he said. What? He could care less. He already got his money. Anyway, so the solid state amps required a little more digestion. For example, there was the biggest problem is psychoacoustics. If somebody knows something is solid state, they're going to have their own bias right away of whether it could sound good or sound bad. Now, one of the things that Roger Balmer did at Yamaha, which I just took my hat off to him, he would invite all the session cats, Jay Graydon, Dean Parks, all these guys to come in and audition Yamaha prototypes. And then in a studio, we'd rent rooms at SIR or whatever the case may be. And the point is, they would bring their own amps and then compare their amps to the Yamaha prototypes and so on, which is a great way to immediately get feedback. Are we in the ballpark? Is this thing going to sound good? Yada, yada, yada. Okay, so when we developed the Fender amps, I did the same thing. I rented SIR in Nashville. I rented Sigma Sound in New York. And I actually I went on a road trip to Canada in a station wagon, a Ford station wagon full of Fender prototypes, to have guys in Toronto, including Rick Emmett, play through these things to see if we're really on track. So anyway, I'm in Nashville. I've got Reggie Young and I've got Steve Gibson and a couple of the other guys who I invited to come in to try the solid state amps. Now they look just like Fenders. I mean, if you saw them, you'd never know it was a transistor was in there. So what I did in order to bypass their psychoacoustic bias, I said to them when I had turned it on, I said, let's give these amps a few minutes to warm up here. The tubes have to stabilize. That was a solid state amp. It was instant on, but I didn't want them to know that. Their first question is, where's the standby switch? I said, well, these things are so advanced that we figured out a way to not require a standby switch on these amps. So after about 5 minutes, we'd plug in and they start playing. Then I could get honest opinions out of them, because if I told them they're solid state, they would say, you're making a solid state Fender? Ugh. So you can picture the reaction. Anyway, it was great because I got some good feedback on the amplifiers, and eventually they went into production and sold very well. And then am I talking too much? We doing good?
No, we're fine.
Okay, so about that time, Roger Balmer was establishing Fender Japan, because he realized that in order for us to really sell a lot of Fenders everywhere, we would have to manufacture Fender guitars overseas for different markets. And so he had a relationship with Kondo Shokai, and Kondo Shokai was run by a gentleman named Kojima, wonderful guy, loved Kojima-san. And he had a relationship with Fuji Gangaki, Konda Shokai did, because he had the Goya brand, and he also had a relationship with Fujigen for years and years and years. Excuse me, the Greco brand. I'm sorry, not Goya, Greco. So, for instance, if you're in Tokyo in 1981 and you're on the subway going through Konda, you would look up and actually see a giant, one of those giant, huge illuminated neon signs, Greco, on top of the building. And that was the home of Konda Shokai. And so Roger established a partnership with Yamano, who was our importer of the U.S. brand, and Konda Shokai, who would be the distributor and manager of the Fender Japan brand. And that's when the manufacturing started with Fuji Kengaki down in Hamamatsu. So Roger came to me and said, we need to do electronics in Japan. And at the time, the yen was 240 yen to the dollar. Good Lord, was that the glory days of exporting out of Japan. I mean, it wasn't, I think at the moment it's 110 yen or something to the dollar, but I remember it going down to 60 or 70 yen to the dollar. And as a friend of mine inside Nissan said, Paul-san, yen like pachinko machine. Once you open up, balls keep falling down. And so anyway, 240 yen to the dollar. So there was Konda Shokai knew of a karaoke company that manufactured karaoke machines that wasn't doing very well, called Elk Denshi, and they were in Utsunomiya, which is farther north than Tokyo. And so they had an opportunity, Konda Shokai had an opportunity to actually either buy out or lease or something this factory, the Elk Denshi factory. And basically what they did is they rebuilt the whole darn factory to build amplifiers. Now, the original designs for the amplifiers built in Fender Japan were kind of a combination of the solid-state designs from Fender in the United States, and we were making, amps like the Montreux and the Showman and the, goodness gracious, the Harvard and, the collegiate brands, Harvard and Yale and so on here in the United States. And then they needed to have a lot less, the price tag really much lower. So basically the plan was, how do we get into a market globally? This is international business. Okay, let's create a line out of Japan, and Paul, go for it. So I basically worked with the engineers who were hired at Elk Denshi and would take these ideas and actually create amplifiers out of them. And some of the circuitry was similar to the ones that were developed by our guys in Fullerton. And some of the other ones they would actually create themselves out of, for instance, local supply of parts. Like the lower priced amplifiers had, the Sidekick 10. That was actually interesting, that series, the Sidekick series, because we sold many, many thousands. I mean, the sales of the amplifiers, I would see the sales figures, 25,000 of this model, 50,000. I was like, holy cow. And because they were hitting the right price points and we were able to export out of Japan and at an advantageous yen-dollar ratio. And I got to tell you, the engineers up in Elk Denshi, the ones who were working with Fender Japan, were just the greatest guys. And I studied Japanese enough to be able to converse, basic conversation and so on with them, because many of them, they were too shy. They'd learned English, but they were too shy to speak it. And so we'd have a lot of fun together anyway, working on the amplifiers. And the unfortunate thing, I would spend probably a cumulative total of 6 months out of the year traveling, and my family suffered for it. So who's that guy? Oh, that's your father. Nice to visit. Can I get some clean underwear? Oh my Lord.
So at the point though, that you had developed some of these products that, solid state stuff like a Sidekick, I'm assuming is one of the solid state ones that they were manufacturing in Japan because of the difference in the conversion.
Yeah, that's
and
right.
then exporting them. And what was sort of the point with which you had left Fender and then developed your own line of amps?
So essentially, I became persona non grata inside Fender because I was supportive of my boss, who was Roger Palmer, who was putting in a competing bid for the purchase of Fender from CBS. And because of that, I was a political hot potato. And so, I saw the writing on the wall. And basically, as Mark Gander from JBL said, "Hey, I heard you got nuked." And, it was a real shocking experience in a way for me, because I'd really put my heart and soul into all these products for Fender, and then to not be appreciated or whatever, that's the bitch. You're working for a large corporation. Next. And so anyway, I went through a lot of soul searching. I did some consulting for JBL at the time, doing artist relations, believe it or not. And I realized, I'm young. If I don't do it now, I probably never will. So why not? Let me start my amp company.
How old were you at this time?
What's that?
How old were you at this time?
That was 80. I think I was 32 or 33. I think I was 33 at the time.
Yeah, so like my age.
There you go.
Yeah, wow.
And my wife said, "Where's the business plan?" I said, the problem with a business plan is you have to start with an input called capital. We don't have any, so I can't create a business plan. But I tell you what, why don't I do some consulting? We'll save some money. I can buy some parts, stash them away, and when we're ready for production, hey, look what we got, all these pots and caps. So anyway, I did a trip around the world. I did an international trip. I visited a lot of Fender distributors in 1985, and I brought some very preliminary drawings of some products. And I said to them, if I build this, will you buy it? And they said, I came back with 100 orders. That was a lot of orders for me for that TBR dual channel rack unit stereo. And that's really how it started. It was very encouraging. You got 100 orders. Good Lord, make them.
Was this a preamp or what was it?
Integrated amplifier, preamp, and power amp. In rack mount. Now, had you ever seen the Fender stuff I did?
The
rack mount that never got produced?
I never saw the rack mount stuff, no.
So that was very interesting. Bill Mandello, who was in accounting at Fender at the time, who was a CBS guy, here's the conversation. "Hey, Bill, we're coming out with these like incredible rack mount amps. We're not going to sell a lot of them. We're going to sell to the upper echelon of guitar players. They're going to be the guys going out on the road, but the image for Fender is going to be wonderful. Look at all these pros we got using our gear. Well, how many of them are you going to sell? Well, 300 or 400 a year. That's ridiculous." So guess what? They never went into production, even though they had done all the R&D and was ready to go, because they just didn't seem like enough to please the accountants. So anyway, I continued on the rack mount thing, and there was a couple reasons for it. One, I thought it was a real need because people were still doing big racks and needing an amp for it. And the second reason is, if you're building something in a garage and you don't have a cabinet shop, building a rack product is actually a pretty good idea. So that's kind of how we did it.
Well, and everybody, shortly, I guess I don't remember what year the Soldano X88 came out, but that was like a huge thing everybody wanted. Also the ADA preamps, but all that was usually disaggregated. You still had to go and get your H&H power amp or what was it?
Boy, you got a hell of a, wait a minute, you're not old enough to remember H&H power amps. What are you talking about? You weren't even born yet.
Yeah, the H&H power amp, or then I guess it wasn't Fry at that time.
No, he wasn't building amps at that time. But the H&H, it's so interesting. Thank you for reminding me. I remember. Yeah. Wait a minute, you weren't born. How did you know that?
Right. Well, I studied all the wet dry systems, that like Van Halen and those guys would use, and they'd always invariably have these H&H power amps to feed the wet cabinets that they had, that were, well, I guess at that time they weren't really 100% wet, but because they would mix the dry in with the wet, basically making it a stereo system. This is before they the dry amp.
Pseudo stereo system.
Yeah. Well, it was their way to do stereo using 100% wet effects and parallel mixers,
Correct.
And then have the ability to blend back in the dry tone. But man, and they were, I'm presuming at that time they were all because they had to load the amp that was the dry amp somehow. That would have been all resistive.
And they were not reactive loads.
Yeah, all resistive loads. Yeah. Or I guess they could have had a speaker cabinet and just put it somewhere else and used it. They
did that as well. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's true.
Yeah. So the next thing I want to ask you about is, this is sort of a geeky, silly question. What did part sourcing look like back then? Because now we all take for granted that, that you have Mauser and DigiKey and all these things. You can just go and type in your part number and you can really find it pretty easily, or use their filters to find whatever spec you need. What was part sourcing like back then?
Hang on a second. I got it.
No problem.
Are we still on?
Yeah.
Okay. Sorry, there was a. Why am I not hearing you right there? Let's see. Hang on. Oh my God.
Can you hear me, Paul?
Yeah, I can hear you. Can you see me?
I can't see you, but I can hear you. I can see you now.
Hang on one second. There we go.
I can see you.
And will you forgive me about that? Somebody's calling. My wife is calling me on the phone, so I apologize.
No, it's okay. If you need to take it, we could start it back up again if that's more convenient.
Yeah, that's okay. So what was your question? You were talking about the geeky. Okay, so here's what it was. You're probably not old enough to know how Mauser started.
Was it just a catalog?
It was a little flyer. And they were out in Santee, California, and they would have a bunch of surplus parts and these parts and those parts and so on. But it was cool stuff. It kind of reminds me a little bit of Jameco Electronics. They would have, it was more of a flyer, and then it would get a little fatter and fatter. But at that time, we had Yale, we had Amatron, we had Pacific Radio, and we had ITV Electronics over on Olympic Boulevard. And Apex was blazing out in the valley for surplus parts. The Slaters, and let's see, we had, basically you could go into Yale and ask for resistors. They actually had resistors and capacitors in stock. And that was amazing. And the same thing with Pacific Radio, where they'd actually have small parts. So, it wasn't like Akihabara in Japan, but at least you could get what you needed. If you had to run out and get some, 1 watt carbon resistors, they were there. So it was actually pretty cool. They had tubes in stock, etc. When I moved to San Diego in '72 from New York, we had Western Radio, which was downtown San Diego, and they were a absolutely full electronics parts house. It was wonderful. You needed a 500 volt, 20 microfarad cap, they had it. So, when DigiKey and Mauser really started to expand and go up, you stopped worrying about it, unless you needed some emergency parts. And then eventually the studios started ordering from those folks, and the need for a parts house kind of disappeared over time, sadly.
Right. Yeah. I was just, it's curious because I know it's so easy, if you need Hammond boxes, or if I need, emergency parts, it's very easy to get them, next day or overnighted or whatever. Pacific Radio, I'm sure now is not exactly as it used to be, even though it still exists.
Oh my God, that's an understatement. They're lovely guys, the Phillips brothers, wonderful guys. But, basically, if you need some spray or you needed a rack piece or something, they're there.
Right.
cables.
Yeah, they have all the built-in and Canary and all that stuff, or whatever you need. They definitely have it. I'm curious to go back to the conversation about buffers a little bit. Like, obviously you were limited in what was available at the time, but do you have any preference kind of now as to whether it's a bipolar junction transistor or a FET or a MOSFET or an op-amp based buffer as far as the composition is concerned?
Well, the problem with IC chips of that era is they had Class A/B output stages in the IC chip. They did that to conserve power. But as such, there's this very subtle amount of crossover distortion from that output stage. And my favorite buffers are basically FET to bipolar, where you're using an NPN and a FET, your impedance matching with a FET. And depending on the FETs, I mean, sadly, we no longer have FETs like we used to because Toshiba is out of the FET building business. And we still buy surplus Toshiba FETs to use in our effects pedals. But it's really hard. There's not too many small signal JFETs available these days. But, from a manufacturing simplicity standpoint, like, for instance, I like the sound of the National LF351s. I thought they were a pretty good sounding low current product. And that's what I used in the buffers. You didn't need a dual, you had a single. 353s sounded good. They had a good sound. We commonly use TLO 72s currently, and they're a decent chip. Hang on one second. I'm really having a problem. Here we go. Let's see. There we are. Sorry about that. But I prefer actually using discrete circuits as buffers. They sound much better. And then you have a Class A output stage, but you've got to do some really good stuff with it. You need some current mirrors and so on if you're trying to run a balance line in. Doing a buffer amplifier with FETs actually kind of almost looks like the early stages of a power amplifier, because you've got all kinds of things to establish the currents for the FETs. You want the FETs to be in a complementary pair. I mean, it just goes on and on. I love the sound of discrete.
Yeah. Well, I think a lot of people do. A lot of the, the Pete Cornish buffer is, I think, Class A. The only trouble I've seen, with some of the BJT ones is that they can't get back to unity gain completely compared to the op-amp style ones.
I mean, I guess we could, what we need to do is wait till the virus is over and then go out for beer. And then we're going to have a bunch of napkins with pens, and we're going to start drawing out our favorite buffer circuits. I mean, that's what we need to do.
I don't like the TLO 80 or TLO 72 for a buffer, so we'll have to. Well, I can't, because you can't. I guess you could run it to 0 on the output impedance, but it's not that stable at 0. Because don't they say in the specs on it that it should be like at 1K or above? The TLO 72?
I don't remember.
Well, I'll give you one of my buffers, and you can look at it. But do you have a range that usually you would say, if somebody's going to go out and get a buffer now, what would you say they should look for input and output impedance generally?
Oh my God! Well, obviously you're going to need a minimum of a meg, if not 2 meg, on an input impedance. I mean, if it's going to go into your guitar, right. No load. And then the output stage, I mean, if they really trick, they'd have a complementary pair on the output after the chip to drive low impedance loads. The problem is with chips like the OP275, which is a lovely chip, they sound really marvelous, and they're able to drive reasonably low impedance loads, the 75, but they require too much input current, to bias them correctly. And so you really can't use them on a 2 meg input. So you're almost, if I was to draw a schematic of the ideal buffer, it would probably be, a complementary output, a driver, and 2 FETs and a current source on the front end of it. I would say that would probably be my ideal buffer.
Mm-hmm.
And as you'd be able to drive, provided you put a heat sink on the output transistors, you could easily drive a 100 ohm load or a 50 ohm load without, taxing it.
Yeah.
There's very few chips that can do that. I mean, a true 50 ohm load,
Yeah.
so that you could run, like a 47 ohm source resist out of it, so you could drive long lines.
I'll have to. Well, you probably know. There's a Burr Brown one that can do it. It's not,
which
but it's good. What the other thing I wanted to ask you about is like what was the most like when you developed Rivera amplification? What would you say, like, after you came out with the rack unit, was there a single product that you felt like really catapulted Rivera amplification as a brand that you found it really kind of like,
our combos?
Which was the first one you think that was?
The M60 M100 channel switching combo that had so many features on it. I'm not going to slog Mesa Boogie. They build great products, and Randall Smith's a wonderful guy. But the first time that I tried plugging into a Mark IV or maybe a Mark V, it took me a long time to figure it out. And that's what people's reactions were to my combo when it came out. It had way too much shit in it. Joey Brasler, who is a dear friend and I love, told me after I developed the amplifier, I had him come over, "Why do you need all this shit on this amp?" Slave Master, who cares? Effects loops, what do you need that? Make a 100-watt Marshall, Paul. So anyway, what was this? I would say our combos when we did, because you're able to sell to a lot more people. And that was the problem with the rack mount amps, is a rack mount stereo integrated amplifier has a very small audience. And as people went away from racks, it became a smaller audience. And then, of our TVR rack series, I can't remember, we've sold 2,500, 3,000 of them or something across the globe. But the combos, of course, is a whole nother story. And that's really what really took off, is when we started doing the combos. And that was 89, NAMM show 89 or 90, I think we showed them off. I'm pretty sure it was 89.
Is that the one that Paul Jackson Jr. was using forever?
Paul Jackson Jr., I don't know if he had one of those.
Or did he have the knucklehead or something like that?
He's had a couple of our amplifiers, but I can't remember him having one of those. But
there's an old lesson video that he put out, and in the background there's like 2 stereo Rivera combos, that are sitting behind him, and I would always remember watching. It was like,
I think those were our 55s. That was the first series where we slimmed down the cabinet, slimmed down the features. Still had an active effects loop, but it was channel switching, much simplified. It didn't have so many push pulls and gazoutas and that sort of thing.
Well, were you the first person you were aware of that was doing active effects loops on amplifiers? As far as
funny you say that, because what's his first name? Guitar player with the last name of Kaiser.
Henry Kaiser?
Henry Kaiser calls me up on the phone and goes, "So, Paul, who had the first amp with effects loops?" I said, "Well, I did, my Fenders." He goes, "Wrong." "What do you mean, Henry?" He goes, "No, the first effects loops were in Selmer amplifiers out of England in 1965 or 3 or something." So he was tackling this for some magazine, trying to find out, I would say I was very early on, and I don't remember anybody else having amplifiers with level controls for send and return like I did, and the fact is, on my Yamahas, the original Yamaha prototypes, we actually had a buffer on the front that you could patch effects loops through the front panel, and it, et cetera, et cetera. But I would say the stuff I did modifying amplifiers, as well as the Fender Concert with active effects loops, I don't remember really anybody else having that.
Yeah, it's a really smart idea. I wish that for some, that our industry established a level, however, for what they can, you know.
Hey, wait a minute. They took years to get MIDI. What do you mean establish?
Yeah,
Yeah, can I ask you a question?
sure.
We have amplifiers that have headphone outputs. What's a standard headphone impedance?
Right. Yeah. Okay. Your guess is as good as mine.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's even if there was an established thing, the pedals would also have to be the ones that could go in and effects would have to be able to meet that criteria too. And so
Yeah.
that's why you don't really see it. Do you have any preference as far as tube buffered effects loop versus solid state? Or the reason
Well,
you want
the nice thing about using a cathode follower like I did at the Fender concert for the tube effects loops is they sound good. Kind of the side effect of it is now you got to worry about microphonic tubes. And if you're going into a big solid state chain, does it really matter? I mean, if you got 20 pedals on a pedal board and they're all solid state, and then you're going to argue it needs to be tube driven. Okay, you could make that argument. I mean, why not? But it seems that you could also do it okay doing solid state like we do with our amplifiers. Now, the TBRs had tube sends and returns, and they were not solid states. But when we did the M&S series, which was our stereo combo amp and so on, it's just, darn it, we ran out of tubes. I mean, we already had 6 or 7 tubes to begin with in the preamp.
Right. I mean, I typically prefer solid state effects loops generally, just because I want it to be as linear as it can be, hitting the stuff. And also noise wise, certainly. I mean, it's not that tube effects loops are going to be crazy noisy, but you could definitely get it quieter doing it solid state.
Yeah, exactly. That's correct.
Yeah.
But run into purist dudes, then it's like a whole rabbit hole you go to. That. My favorite phone call was a guy out of Boston who called me, I don't know, 86 or something like that. And he said, "You don't have any square corners in your wiring, do you?" I said, "Square corners?" I said, "What do you mean?" He says, "Well, you don't like route your wires and then do a 90-degree turn." I go, "Oh my God, why would you ask that?" He says, "Well, that's because the electrons jump off, the end of the wire." Okay.
Right.
That's my.
It's just like a diving board for electrons.
There they go. And God bless him. He sincerely thought that, but that's my point about going down the rabbit holes.
Oh yeah, I got this question on a live stream we did recently about this $400 AC power cord that would go into your pedal.
Oh, wait a minute! I've gotten those calls too. I think I have a $400 power cord hanging up over here.
Yeah,
it's amazing the tonal difference.
Well, I just told them, I said, let's just pretend that it is the best. It has all the properties that they claim. You'd still have to rewire. You'd have to take all the Romex out of your house and rewire everything out to your main line.
Were you listening in on the conversation I had with the guy? I mean,
is that what you told him?
Yeah. I mean, where do you want to go back to? Your mains panel has screw-in fuses from 1947, and you've got button and whatever they call that wiring with cotton frayed wire in the walls, or Romex or whatever. I mean, how far do you want to go? You want to go back to the power line?
Yeah, it's great. And the other thing too that a lot of people don't realize is that depending on where they are in relationship to the mains on their block, the first house is usually going to be maybe 3-4 volts, 5 volts hotter than the last house on the block.
You are so dead nuts right. Absolutely. You are so when we were building that recording studio up in upstate New York, the problem that we had was huge voltage swings because of where we were on the line. So when Farmer Brown down the road there was milking his cows, the voltage the voltage swing was, I mean, it was kind of thing, lights dimmed. Oh, Farmer Brown's milking his cows. I mean, it was just hysterical. But we had a problem where I remember it swung up to about 132 volts or 134 volts and started wiping out some tube equipment. The filter capacitors, because of the high voltage.
Yeah,
Anyway.
it's interesting. Have you ever dealt with biasing issues where like you bias something and then somebody has something that's really on the extreme end of that where it affects their bias?
Well, I mean, it raises their high voltage and their bias simultaneously. So you could argue there is some tracking on that. But at some point, I mean, for example, let's pretend you have a high line and that particular power transformer had tended to be high on the filament. So instead of 6.3 volts, let's say it was 6.6, 6.7, then you get a high line. So not only is your high voltage up, your bias is up, but now those poor tubes are at 7.3 or 7.5 volts or something. And with that much heat on the cathode, it's throwing off, I mean, the tube is not within its operating parameters. But what are you gonna do?
Yeah, it's true. I was also thinking, I had this conversation a couple of days ago with this power supply manufacturer talking about switch mode power supplies versus linear power supplies. And I was thinking, man, when you were building rigs, there was no, you had to make all that stuff from scratch. It
was all linear. I mean, we talked about doing switch mode stuff, 30 or 40 years, whenever it was, charge pumping and all kinds of stuff. But the problem is it all came down to noise. And if you have a really nice power transformer shielded and a good regulated supply and so on, you're not going to have any power supply noise. And you don't have to worry about any high frequency radiation or whatever. I mean, some of those switchers that have come out of Asia are dreck. They are poop. The amount of noise that they generate is just, oh my God, dog doo-doo. So a linear power supply, as you well know, is going to sound great if it's properly designed.
Yeah, I think the switch mode, there's a couple good ones though now that supersede, I think, some of the linear ones. I think it'll be a matter of time before we don't see, at least in the pedal board side, just because of the efficiency, the weight.
Oh yeah, weight is a big size.
But yeah, I mean, I think that the problem that I've run into with some of the linear supplies is, some of them will put, or a lot of them aren't really actually toroid and they claim to be. They're actually like C-core or R-core. And some of the good ones will put like a cap over the top to try to eliminate the electromagnetic field, like on a vertical axis. So they'll like cap it on the top to try to eliminate it. And I don't know if they're using steel or mu metal or what they're using. But even if you dress wires near some of these power supplies, you'll get some issues with hum. Or I used to just take an old pickup that I didn't know out of like an 80s Fender that wasn't worth anything, and I would put it over the power supply to try to identify where the electromagnetic field was.
Yeah, great way to do it. You basically built a probe.
Yeah.
Smart. Good way to do it.
Or you could take a wah. That's another way to do it.
That poor inductor in the wah.
Yeah, but that was something. Oh, another thing I want to ask you about your amps. So let's say somebody's got a stereo situation. They got 2 Rivera amps on stage, or for gig 1. But then gig 2, they're playing a club. They can't do it. They're going to go to only 1 amp. A lot of people I've noticed in the pedalboard side of things, they want to do all this mono summing where they take a stereo output, interface, and they try to merge them. But I found it to be really problematic doing it that way, as opposed to just say using just the left output, in particular with modulation stuff like tremolos and choruses, because typically those they invert the polarity on them. And then when you sum them in mono, you actually don't hear them at all when you engage them.
Yeah, or your bottom end drops out or whatever. Yeah, that's an issue. It's totally an issue. I mean, how would I solve it?
Yeah, I mean, would you just tell them to plug into one side, or what would be your solution to it, or build a mixer? I don't know.
I think, a Mackie 4-channel mixer with phase switches on the different inputs could be one way to do it. just for expediency's sake, a $40 or $60 mixer or something, even though the idea of a Behringer is very depressing. But anyway, besides that, that would be one way to do it.
What about in terms of stereo systems and the need for isolation transformers? Have you found any that you feel like work really well? Because the issue that I've seen is that there are mostly output transformers that people are using on this, which can be good in a certain range for galvanic isolation. Doesn't really do a lot for buzz, maybe does something for hum.
Are we talking about ground loop hum?
Yeah, stereo system, and you need to have galvanic isolation of one of the amplifiers because it's on a different ground or it's creating some sort of hum.
You know what? There's a 1-to-1 transformer that Cinemag makes that's lovely. And so,
small box, or is it huge?
It's small, yeah, in a mu metal can.
Really?
Yeah. So I would probably use something like that. You're taxing me a little bit because I haven't built pedal boards in so long, but I'm a huge Cinemag fan. Dave runs Cinemag really, really well, and they build some bitchin' transformers. So I would use a 1-to-1, transformer from them.
Have you found, though, that they're more effective if you use them right before you go into the amplifier as opposed to where it is on the pedal board in terms of its effectiveness?
I wouldn't be able to give you an intelligent answer on that. I would probably put it on the pedal board myself before you drive a long line rather than have it on the input of the amp. That would just be my gut feel, just so that you're running the cable, after the transformer and not before the transformer.
And I guess
whatever you do, don't use line transformer.
I guess you'd want to make sure you had a good buffer, though, that could actually drive the transformer.
Yes. Yeah, correct.
Yeah, I know that everybody these days seems to like Jensen for this purpose.
Well, Jensen is now owned by
Radio,
which is now owned by Radio was purchased from Ultimate Support. I think purchased Radio. Peter Jensen got out of the business at the right time and sold off Radio, I think, to Ultimate Support. And so he bought Jensen Transformers. But, the nice thing about dealing with Dave at Cinemag is, Dave, here's my engineering problem. Do you have a solution? Yeah. And since he's the guy that's designing and building the transformers, he's the guy you want to talk to.
Yeah. Yeah, there was one guy at Jensen for a long time that was pretty amazing named Bill Whitlock. Did you ever know that guy?
I've heard his name, but I don't think I ever met him or talked with him.
Yeah, I haven't met him in person either, but there's been some email exchanges between him and some of the other guys that work on some of the projects that we do.
Was this before Radio, or is this?
I think it was concurrent. I think he still consults. I think he does a lot of the design stuff, and I'm not really, I don't know very much about transformer design. It's almost like a whole different field, and those guys know things that I have. I'm complete novice. It's like speaking a different language or something when I hear them talk about stuff.
Well, audio transformer design is frickin' voodoo. They should be worshipped, the engineers who know how to do that stuff, because none of it's written in books. And again, they built up this incredible lookup table over years and years and years and years of experience, especially output transformers for tube amps. And so anyway, when you speak with, for example, the original Jensen transformers were done by Reichenbach Engineering. And Reichenbach was the chief engineer at Altec doing peerless transformers. Talk about a history.
Right.
So peerless transformers onto building for Jensen. Dean Jensen was just a sales guy. So it was Reichenbach Engineering that built it. And they're probably still making the designs that were designed originally by Reichenbach Engineering. So you're absolutely right. It's another world. It's another way. I had Tommy Reichenbach design my output transformers for 60-watt and 100-watt amplifiers. And the 109002 and 109004, the 50-watt and the 100-watt, were designed by Reichenbach. And so I was able to get what I wanted out of those transformers. Anyway, yes, voodoo.
Yeah. Now, if I were to get a Rivera amp, if I were in the market to buy an amplifier, what would you say is like the classic Rivera amp that you think is like your signature, like what's the double to In-N-Out Burger? What is that kind of classic Rivera amplifier that you would say you got?
I have an answer for you. You've got 7 daughters, and somebody says, which one of your daughters is the most beautiful?
The first one. Yeah.
Depends on who. Wait a minute. Depends on who's in the room.
Right. Well, certainly, you have equal love for all of your children. But if you had to say, like, what is sort of identified maybe by the market, let's take the pressure off of you. What's identified as by the market, would you say, is kind of being the quintessential Rivera amplifier? Like if they're gonna, put one of your amps in sort of the Guitar Hall of Fame, which amp do you think that is?
I have no idea. I mean, my goodness gracious. I'm proud that we've really built a lot of great amplifiers. And certainly our current stuff, we've got some really neat amps. And now that we've answered a lot of the current, for example, that Clubster Royale recording, having, speaker cabinet emulation and all that inside. But it's a newer model. One in the Hall of Fame, probably the one that we've manufactured the most of was the Chubster series. And, we've made many thousands of those. So that would probably have been one of our most popular in terms of selling them. But, I'm proud to say that we've built a lot of great amps. And fortunately, we really don't have any dogs that bite our ankles.
Right.
And we've avoided some of the pitfalls of other amp companies.
Yeah. I mean, you've transcended, like that's the one thing that I look at a lot about brands is like, who's still around, because there's a lot of people that do really great and they have, maybe a decade of success, but how long can you really stay in the zeitgeist of continuing to stay relevant, and there's,
well, I got to tell you, the situation right now with the virus and the fact that companies are shut down, and I really don't know how much longer, I'm not going to name names, but I talked to somebody that has, works with large bands on touring and so on. They're in terrible pain right now because there's nobody performing or touring.
Yeah.
So I think we're going to see a lot of devastation, and not in a good way. I mean, this is very challenging times for everybody. I hope we survive, and we certainly will try. And certainly that we're a small company gives us some horsepower to survive, because we don't have, 200,000 square feet of industrial space that we have to worry about.
Right.
But I appreciate that you're knowing about, people that have done well. And I hope, or the length of time. One of the things I'm very proud of is we never went overseas for manufacture.
Yeah.
And we've always been prided ourselves for being a USA and built, our chassis are built in Simi Valley, and our transformers come out of the companies that have supplied Fender and other people out of Chicago. And, we just really proud of that. And I hope we can continue in business, because it is challenging. There's very few music stores open right now.
Yeah.
And there are musicians who thought that they could rely on playing music as a career. And my heart goes out to them, because they are our customers, our clients, our friends. And this is not an easy time for any of us. And besides our personal health, it's just being able to feed our darn families and so on. And there's so many professional musicians that were making really good money touring, and now they have no income.
Yeah.
And, man, this is very challenging times.
Yeah. Well, I certainly, am sending good vibes to everybody in the industry, and I really appreciate your products and your legacy and kind of what you've
Thank you.
done in the industry. And I have I obviously have your Fender console. I know that's not a direct Rivera product, but I also have 4 of your mini rock crushers that are in our NAMM booth, that we use for
Wow.
For this,
Very cool.
because for each, I have like 4 demo boards, in these racks. and then they have like a pull-out drawer that has the pedal board on it, in a rack drawer, and then people listen to it through the mini rock crusher, because that's kind of the voicing that I think it matches up well with just the clean amps and sounds good.
Sure.
Are how many are yours reactive or resistive loads on your like rock crusher recording or on the Venus or?
Well, the rock crusher recording uses those giant ohmite resistors, and then I have a filter network, a reactive filter network, and basically it's a reactive load. However, I've had a competitive amp manufacturer say, when you're using it this way, it's not reactive, but basically it's a reactive load. Now the minis use a filter network that's a reactive filter network on them, and so that's how I'm able to get that reactive response on it. Yeah. If you measure it, it's not like the Roland Boss, that new amp thing.
The Wazacraft, the tube.
Yeah, the Wazacraft thing. I don't know. Okay, so this is a really loaded and interesting point. I want you to pull out a Celestion Vintage 30 16 ohm impedance curve graph.
Yeah, it's not 16 ohm. Well, it's 16 ohms.
No, but you got to be, okay. So then I want you to look at your Marshall 100-watt amp at 80 hertz and tell me what the impedance is that amp is actually seeing. So if you were to actually build a perfect representation of that Celestion speaker from the impedance curve standpoint, is it safe to run a tube amplifier on a 39 ohm load? Is it? Look at it.
Right.
So when you have the thing dimed and you're hitting your open E string, and instead of seeing a nominal 16 ohm load, it's at 39 ohms, take a look at the waveform and measure the peak to peak and tell me if that, and you can hear the output transformer flipping out. Normally you can't hear it because the sound of the stacks of speakers is blaring and you're not listening to the fact that you're hearing the snap crackle sound on the inside of that output transformer as it tries to cope with 39 ohm load or whatever it is in an open E. Just take a look at that. So when people say, well, does it really represent the impedance curve? Okay, go ahead. And then dime your amp through it and just tell me how long your amp lasts. Yeah. And that long argument about that. So I tend to not want, when I'm making a reactive load, like for instance, I measured that Wazacraft. Have you tried measuring the impedance on that thing?
No.
Try it. Go ahead.
Is it actually reactive? I always thought it was all done.
It's reactive. He has a bunch of coils and he's using polarized capacitors and creating what he thinks they are a non-polar, using a couple of polarized capacitors with inductors. But let me tell you, in my personal opinion, and I respect what they did with that product, it's jam-packed with DSP and all kinds of stuff. But I wouldn't personally feel comfortable running my vintage amp dimed through that unit.
Yeah.
That's my personal.
Yeah, it's an interesting. There's only two. There's two that I like that I really stand behind. Both of them are analog. One of them's yours. The other one that I like for certain types of speaker sounds is the Fryette one, the power load.
Mm-hmm.
Not the attenuator one. It's just the load.
I haven't seen it or measured it or anything like that, so I don't know anything about it. I like Stevie's a great guy.
Yeah, they seem to work really well. Who would you say of, other companies, amp companies that you think build a really good amplifier?
I haven't had a chance to really take apart other people's amplifiers, but again, I'll go back. I think Boogie built a good amp, and I know that Bogner does. Reinhold Bogner, God bless him, he's such a unique individual, and he really loves what he builds. So I think Bogner builds good gear. You still have the British guys, the high watt philosophy, building some really good amps. Unfortunately, the stuff that's built in China is, oh my God, I can't recommend any of the brands that build their stuff over there. Certainly, I told you the story about Bugera, I think, didn't I? Okay.
No.
Certainly. What's that?
Tell me about it. I don't think so.
I tell you what, we'll do that over beers.
Okay. yeah, that'll be.
Then I won't get sued.
Now let me ask you this: Do you have any Dumble stories?
Yeah, I got a bunch of double stories, but I don't think we have time. Let's reserve that for the beers too. Make a list.
All right. Yeah, I want to hear that.
Alexander Dumble's a great guy. Howard's awesome. So anyway, and but we got some good stories that we can.
Yeah. He says he came up with the first active effect slip with the Dumbleator.
Okay.
But man, I just wonder why he just didn't build it into the amp. That was my question. Why not just put it in the amp? Why make it separate?
What did he say?
I didn't ask him. I don't know. But I've wondered this.
It was probably just so he could make some more money.
Because
actually, Henry Kaiser had a story about the Dumbulator. So if you want to ask Henry Kaiser, he'd probably give you a good story on the Dumbulator, how it came about, that sort of stuff. Because he rattled that off to me when he called me about effects loops.
Yeah, I'm sure he did, because he was running all sorts of 2290s and that sort of stuff, and he wanted it in the loop. So I'm sure he probably.
I love Henry Kaiser. He is so awesome.
Yeah,
buddy. Going to record an album in Antarctica. Yes. Yeah, that's my man.
You should hear his newer album called Skip to the Solo, where it's just a 45-minute solo is the album.
That's my man.
Well, Paul, thank you so much for giving me so much of your time today and going through some of this stuff. And I look forward to our follow-up conversation when some of this stuff is remediated to the degree that we can get together socially.
Socialize. The first thing I'm going to do is see my granddaughter, and she may not want to see me because I'm going to hug her for about 8 hours, and get a chance to socialize with so many of my friends that we were only on a phone conversation with,
Yeah.
So, and the thing I pray for is, first of all, her health. And the second of all is for all our musician community to heal and be able to do what they do best, which is to create and perform beautiful music. I tend to think we're going to have a renaissance of live music like we've never seen, because I think we're all starving. And, I hope that we can go and, hear music from our friends and colleagues and so on. And I just look forward to that day. And I look forward to having a beer with you.
Yeah, sounds good. I agree with you completely. I think it is ripe for definitely a rebirth, because there's so much that we don't realize that music does for us, the healing powers of music and the camaraderie that's really built in live music in a group of people. It's really how we were meant to do it. Since time immemorial.
You're so right. I mean, thinking about Don Randy and the Baked Potato, I mean, how many great musicians have graced that stage in the Baked Potato, the legends of legends of legends. And man, I'm dying to go back. Please open up.
Yeah, I'll take it. I'll take it.
We're all not going to die by doing it.
Yeah.
And I might thank you for today. I'm down to 3% on my phone. So
all right. Thanks, Paul. See you later.
Take care. Thanks again for you.
Yeah.
See ya.
Bye.
So that was Paul Rivera. Lots of very interesting historical stuff that he's talking about in terms of, how he got into the industry, working with Fender, developing his own stuff, starting with his rack units, and now just is sort of a legacy guy, and he's really figured out a way to make his company relevant through multiple decades, which I can assure you is no easy feat as a business owner myself. So I'm really grateful to Paul for his time and for kind of walking us through the timeline of his career. And I hope there's more that we get to see from him in the coming years. I want to thank all of the people behind the scenes that make this podcast possible. Hunter Harrison for all the editing and mixing of this podcast, Mason Mejia for co-production, and Tim Marco for all of the music that you hear during the podcast. Until next time, I'm Mason Marangella, the Rig Doctor. See you later.